Imagine sitting under the burning afternoon sun, doing nothing wrong, and still being treated like you don't belong there, like your presence alone is a problem waiting to be removed. The heat pressed down on the cracked sidewalk of a quiet downtown street just past 2:15 p.m., the kind of dry, relentless heat that made the air shimmer and the metal bench feel warmer than it should. And there sat Samuel Carter, a 72-year-old man with tired eyes and steady hands, dressed in a worn but neatly pressed button-down shirt, resting after a long walk that his knees no longer handled the way they used to. His breathing slow, measured, as if each inhale carried not just air but years of discipline, of restraint, of choosing peace over reaction. And around him the city moved on without noticing, cars passing, distant sirens humming somewhere far away, the low murmur of people talking across the street blending into the background like static, until the sound of heavy footsteps cut through it. All sharp, deliberate, authoritative, the kind of sound that made people glance up without knowing why. And Officer Ryan Blake stepped into the frame of that quiet moment. His uniform crisp, his badge catching a flicker of sunlight, his posture stiff with a confidence that bordered on something colder, something less patient. His eyes scanning before settling on Samuel, as if he had already made up his mind before a single word was spoken. And for a second, just a second, nothing happened, the silence stretching thin like it was holding its breath. And then Blake tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You can't just sit here," he said, his voice flat but edged with something sharper underneath, something dismissive, something practiced. Samuel looked up slowly, not startled, not afraid, just present, his gaze calm as it met the officer's. "Just resting, son," he replied quietly, his tone steady, respectful, the kind of voice that carried weight, without ever needing to rise. But Blake didn't hear it that way, or maybe he chose not to, because the next thing he did wasn't about listening, it wasn't about understanding, it was about control, about making a point that didn't need to be made. He unscrewed the cap of a plastic water bottle in his hand, the small click of it almost too quiet to notice, and before anyone around could fully process what was happening, he tipped it forward, letting the water spill out in a slow, deliberate stream that caught the sunlight for a split second before it landed, soaking into Samuel's shirt, running down his face, dripping from his chin onto the pavement below, and the world seemed to pause right there, like even the air didn't know how to move next. A couple of people across the street froze mid-step, someone's phone lifted instinctively, recording without fully understanding why. And Samuel didn't react the way people expected. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He didn't stand up in anger. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment as the water traced its path down his skin, then opened them again, calm, steady, present, and slowly, with a dignity that didn't ask for permission, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded handkerchief, dabbing at his face with careful, deliberate movements, as if the act itself was a quiet statement, as if he refused to let the moment define him. And Blake let out a short laugh, not loud, not explosive, just enough to be heard, enough to carry across the space like an echo of something ugly that didn't need volume to be understood. "People like you always think you can just sit wherever you want," he muttered, shaking his head slightly. But Samuel's eyes stayed on him, not with anger, not with fear, but with something deeper, something steadier, and after a beat, he spoke. Again, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the heat and the tension alike. "Is this how you serve the law?" And for a fraction of a second, something flickered in Blake's expression, something uncertain, something he didn't expect, but it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced again by that same rigid posture, that same hardened edge, because he wasn't here to question himself, not today, not in front of a man he had already decided didn't matter, and around them, the quiet street had changed without anyone announcing it, the stillness heavier now, thicker, like it was holding on to something that hadn't happened yet, but was already on its way, because what Blake didn't see, what he couldn't possibly know in that moment, was that this wasn't just another afternoon, this wasn't just another man on a bench, and the silence Samuel carried wasn't empty, it wasn't weakness, it was something else entirely, something waiting, something watching, something that didn't need to shout to be heard. The water kept dripping from the edge of the bench onto the concrete, forming a small, uneven pattern that spread slowly under Samuel's shoes. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what had just happened, the kind of silence that carries discomfort more loudly than any argument ever could. And somewhere behind the thin line of parked cars a woman lowered her sunglasses slightly, her eyes narrowing as she looked closer, while a young man standing near a bus stop shifted his weight and raised his phone higher, the faint red recording light blinking without sound. And Officer Blake seemed to grow taller in that quiet, as if the lack of resistance fed something inside him, his shoulders squared, his chin lifting just a fraction. "I told you already," he said, his voice sharper now, louder, making sure it reached the people who were pretending not to listen. "This is not a place for loitering." And Samuel folded his handkerchief carefully, smoothing it once before placing it back into his pocket, his movements unhurried, precise, as though time itself slowed down around him. "I hear you," he replied, not raising his voice, not matching the tone, just stating it, calm and grounded. And that response, that lack of pushback, seemed to frustrate Blake more than any argument would have, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to dominate, just a stillness that refused to bend. And Blake took a step closer, his shadow falling across Samuel's feet, blocking out the thin slice of sunlight that had been resting there. "Then stand up and move along," he said. And there it was, the expectation, the command, the moment where most people would comply just to end it, just to escape the attention. But Samuel did not move right away. Instead, he placed both hands on the edge of the bench, not to stand, but to steady himself, his fingers curling slightly against the warm metal. And he looked up again, meeting Blake's gaze with the same quiet presence. "I will," he said, in a moment. And that small delay, that simple choice of timing, shifted something in the air, subtle but undeniable, because it was not defiance in the way Blake understood it. It was control, quiet control, and across the street the murmur grew a little louder, people beginning to whisper, to question, to notice details they had missed before, the way Samuel carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he did not rush. And one voice, low and uncertain, slipped through the background. "Wait, I think I have seen him before." But it was swallowed quickly by the hum of passing traffic, and Blake exhaled sharply, a sound of impatience more than anger, his grip tightening slightly around the now empty bottle in his hand. "You do not get to decide when," he replied, each word clipped, controlled, and Samuel's eyes softened, not in submission, but in something closer to understanding, as if he had heard that tone before, many times, in many different voices, over many different years. And he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "I used to tell my son something," he said, his voice steady, almost reflective now, as though he was speaking to the air as much as to the man in front of him. "I told him that real authority does not rush people, it earns respect." And for the first time, the words did not just pass through the moment, they settled into it, creating a pause that even Blake could not immediately fill, because there was no obvious response, no quick dismissal that would erase the weight of what had just been said. And somewhere behind them, a car door closed, a deeper sound than the others, heavier, followed by the low hum of an engine cutting off. But neither of them turned yet, the focus still locked between them, and Blake shook his head slightly, as if brushing off something invisible. "You think a speech is going to change anything," he said, though there was a hint of something else beneath it now, something less certain. And Samuel let out a quiet breath, not tired, not defeated, just measured. "No," he answered. "But truth has a way of showing up, whether we are ready for it or not." And as those words settled into the heat of the afternoon, the atmosphere shifted again, almost imperceptibly, like the air before a storm that no one has announced yet, but everyone can feel approaching. The sound of the car door closing did not belong to the rhythm of the street. It cut through it, deeper, more deliberate, the kind of sound that made a few heads turn without knowing exactly why. And near the corner a black SUV sat now with its engine silent, its presence understated but unmistakable, clean lines, tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that did not need attention yet always seemed to draw it anyway. And still Samuel and Officer Blake stood locked in that fragile space between words, the heat pressing in, the tension stretching, until a faint murmur began to ripple through the small gathering that had formed, phones still raised, whispers growing just a little more defined. Someone just pulled up, a voice said softly, followed by another. That does not look like just anyone. And Blake glanced briefly over his shoulder, just a flicker of attention, before returning his focus to Samuel as if unwilling to lose control of the moment he had created. Like I said, he continued, his tone tightening again. You need to move, but the certainty in his voice did not land the same way anymore, not with the air shifting around them, not with eyes watching more closely now. And Samuel, still seated, placed his hands on his knees and slowly rose to his feet, not rushed, not forced, but on his own terms, his posture straightening with quiet strength that did not match the way he had been perceived just minutes earlier. And as he stood, the sunlight caught the lines of his face. The years etched there not as weakness, but as something earned, something carried with intention, and for a brief second, Blake hesitated, just enough for it to register, just enough for the moment to tilt slightly off balance. And from the SUV, the driver's side door opened with a controlled, precise motion, and a man stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with the kind of exactness that suggested discipline more than style, his movements efficient, his presence quiet but unmistakably focused. And he did not rush forward. He did not call out. He simply closed the door behind him and took in the scene with a single measured glance, his eyes moving from the small crowd, to the raised phones, to the damp pavement beneath Samuel's feet, and then finally settling on the officer standing too close. And something in that look shifted the air again. Not louder, not dramatic, just different, as if the moment had been claimed by something unseen until now. And a woman near the sidewalk leaned closer to her friend, her voice barely above a whisper. I know him. I think that is Marcus Carter. And the name hung there, uncertain at first, but enough to stir recognition in another voice nearby. No way. Is that really him? And Blake heard it, even if he pretended not to, because his shoulders stiffened just slightly, his grip loosening around the empty bottle as he turned again, this time longer, this time fully, his eyes landing on the man approaching with steady, unhurried steps. And Marcus did not speak right away. He did not interrupt. He simply walked until he stood a few feet away, close enough to see everything clearly, far enough to not invade the space unnecessarily, his gaze moving once more to his father, taking in the damp shirt, the quiet composure, the absence of anger. And for a moment, something personal flickered behind his controlled expression, something that disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by the calm precision of someone who understood exactly where he stood and what this moment required. And Samuel turned, slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, his eyes softening in a way they had not before, not with relief, not with dependence, but with recognition, as if this arrival had not surprised him at all. And Blake cleared his throat, a subtle shift, a reset. Sir, he began, addressing Marcus now, his tone attempting to regain authority. This individual was being asked to move along. But the words felt thinner now, less anchored. And Marcus finally spoke, his voice even, controlled, carrying, without needing volume. I have been watching, he said, his eyes still on Blake. And that single sentence landed heavier than anything raised voices could have achieved, because it was not just about the moment. It was about everything that had led up to it, everything that had already been seen, recorded, understood, and the quiet street that had once ignored Samuel Carter now leaned in, every eye fixed on what would happen next. As the balance of power shifted without a single shout, the words settled into the air with a weight that did not need force to be understood. And for a brief moment, even the distant traffic seemed to quiet itself as if the entire street had leaned in to listen. And Officer Blake straightened instinctively, his posture shifting from casual authority to something more rigid, more careful, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Marcus, trying to place him, trying to regain footing in a situation that no longer felt entirely his. Watching what exactly? Blake asked, his voice measured now, less sharp than before, as if each word had to pass through a filter he had not needed just minutes ago. And Marcus did not answer immediately. He let the question hang, his gaze moving once more to the damp marks on his father's shirt, to the faint trail of water still visible on the pavement. and then back to Blake, his expression composed but unmistakably firm. "Everything that matters," he said quietly, and there was no accusation in his tone, no raised voice, just clarity, the kind that does not invite debate. And behind them the murmurs grew stronger. The name whispered again, clearer this time, carried from one person to another. "That is him. Marcus Carter. Federal." And a man near the curb lowered his phone slightly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to realization. And Blake heard it now, not just the name but the recognition behind it. And something in his stance adjusted again, subtle but visible, his shoulders pulling back, his grip loosening at his sides. "Sir, with all due respect," he began, choosing his words more carefully now. This situation was under control, and Samuel let out a slow breath beside them, not interrupting, not stepping forward, just present, his eyes moving between the two men with quiet awareness. And Marcus gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "Control," he repeated softly, as if testing the word itself. And then he took a single step closer, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to shift the space between them. "Is not measured by how loudly you speak or how quickly someone moves when you tell them to," he continued, his voice steady. "Even, it is measured by how you treat people when no one is supposed to be watching." And that sentence landed differently, deeper, because everyone here was watching now, every phone, every eye, every quiet witness that had chosen to stay. And Blake's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the effort to hold on to something that was slipping. "I followed procedure," he replied, though the confidence behind it had thinned, and Marcus tilted his head just a fraction, considering. "Procedure does not explain intent," he said, and the words did not accuse, they revealed. They opened a space that Blake could not easily close. And the heat of the afternoon pressed in again, but it felt different now, heavier. Like the moment had shifted from action to consequence, and Samuel finally spoke, his voice calm as ever. "Marcus," he said, not loud, not urgent, just enough to draw his son's attention, and Marcus turned to him immediately, the controlled authority softening for a brief second into something personal, something grounded. "I am all right," Samuel added, his tone steady, almost reassuring, as if he was the one offering calm rather than needing it. And Marcus nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried understanding without needing explanation. And then he looked back at Blake, the calm returning, sharper now, more defined. "The question is not whether he can stand or move," Marcus said. "The question is why he had to be treated this way in the first place." And there was no easy answer waiting for that. No simple line that could dissolve what had already been seen. And Blake exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking briefly to the surrounding crowd, to the phone still raised, to the faces no longer neutral, and then back to Marcus. "I did not know who he was," he said, the words slipping out before he could reshape them. And the moment they landed, the air shifted again, quieter, sharper, because that was the truth underneath everything. And Marcus did not react with surprise. He did not raise his voice. He simply held Blake's gaze and replied, "That is exactly the point." And in that instant, the silence that followed spoke louder than anything that had come before it. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had finally been named that could not be undone. And Officer Blake shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but noticeable, as if the ground beneath him had changed in a way he could not quite control, his eyes drifting for just a second toward the small crowd that had now fully stopped pretending not to watch, phones held steady, faces no longer neutral but attentive, measuring, remembering. And when he looked back at Marcus, the certainty he had carried earlier was no longer sitting the same way on his shoulders. "I meant," Blake began, his voice tightening as he searched for footing, "I did not realize there was context." And the word itself sounded uncertain, like it did not belong in the sentence he was trying to build. And Marcus did not interrupt. He allowed the explanation to unfold, not because he accepted it, but because he understood something deeper was being revealed in the attempt. "Context," Marcus repeated slowly, his tone calm but unmistakably firm, "should not determine respect." And he let that settle, not pushing further, not raising his voice, just allowing the weight of it to exist. And Samuel stood beside them, his hands resting loosely at his sides now, his shirt still damp, but his posture unchanged, steady, composed, as if the earlier moment had not taken anything from him. And for a brief second, Blake glanced at him again, really looked this time, not as a problem to remove, not as an inconvenience to manage, but as a person standing directly in front of him. And there was a flicker there, something closer to awareness than authority, something that had not been present before, and it passed quickly, but it left something behind, something he could not ignore anymore. "Sir," Blake said again, this time the word carrying a different weight, directed towards Samuel rather than Marcus. And the shift did not go unnoticed, not by the crowd, not by Marcus, and not by Samuel himself, who met the officer's gaze without triumph, without satisfaction, just acknowledgement. And Blake exhaled slowly, the sound quieter now, less forceful. "I should have handled that differently," he added, the sentence careful, controlled, as if each word had to pass through something he had not used before, and the air seemed to pause again, not in tension this time, but in recognition, because something had changed, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to be seen. And Marcus watched him closely, not with approval, not with dismissal, but with a measured understanding of what it meant for someone to reach that point in front of witnesses, in front of consequence. And he nodded once, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement of the moment itself. "What matters," Marcus said, "is not just what you say now, but what you understand moving forward." And Blake lowered his gaze briefly, a small, almost imperceptible motion, before looking back up again. And in that space, something quieter replaced the earlier edge, something less certain, but more real. And Samuel shifted slightly, his voice entering the moment again with the same calm presence it had carried from the beginning. "Respect is not complicated," he said gently, his eyes steady on Blake. "It just requires seeing people as they are, not as you assume they are." And there was no accusation in it, no anger, just truth, simple and direct, and it landed in a way that no raised voice could have achieved. And Blake nodded slowly, the movement small but deliberate, as if he was absorbing something he had not fully considered before. And behind them, the quiet hum of the street began to return, cars moving again, conversations picking up in low tones. But the moment itself remained, held in the devices that had recorded it, in the minds of those who had witnessed it, in the subtle shift of posture, of tone, of understanding that had unfolded without force. And Marcus glanced once more at his father, his expression softening just slightly, a silent check, a quiet confirmation. And Samuel gave the smallest nod in return, a gesture that carried more than words. And then Marcus looked back at Blake one final time, his voice steady, composed. "You did not know who he was," he said, echoing the earlier statement. "But now you do." And he paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle. "Make sure that changes how you see the next person." And there was no threat in it, no raised authority, just a line drawn clearly, unmistakably. And Blake held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding again, more firmly this time. And as the weight of the moment began to ease, the street returning to its usual rhythm, it was clear that something had shifted, not because power had been used loudly, but because it had been revealed quietly, in a way that could not be unseen. The moment did not end with a sudden movement or a loud conclusion. It eased, slowly, like tension releasing from a tightly held breath, and yet something remained in the air, something that could not be undone or dismissed, because what had been seen could not be unseen. And as the quiet hum of the street returned in fragments, the weight of what had happened lingered in every glance, every lowered phone, every step that resumed with just a little more awareness than before. And Officer Blake stood there for a second longer than necessary, as if unsure whether to leave or to stay, his posture no longer rigid with authority but held in a careful balance. And when he finally stepped back, it was not a retreat in defeat, but a recognition that the space no longer belonged to him in the way it had just minutes earlier. And Samuel adjusted the sleeve of his damp shirt with the same calm precision he had carried from the beginning, not hurried, not embarrassed, simply restoring himself to the moment. And Marcus watched quietly, his presence steady, not dominating the space but anchoring it. And as Blake turned slightly, preparing to move on, he paused, just briefly, his voice lower now, more grounded than before. "Sir," he said again, this time clearly directed at Samuel. And Samuel looked at him, not with expectation, not with judgment, just with openness. And Blake hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if the words he was about to say required more effort than anything he had done that day. "You deserved better than that," he admitted. And the sentence was simple, but it carried a weight that was new, unfamiliar, and real, and Samuel nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, not accepting the past, but recognizing the present. "We all do," he replied gently, and there was no bitterness in it, no lingering resentment, just a truth that extended beyond the moment itself, and Blake took that in, the words settling somewhere deeper than the surface, before giving a final nod and stepping away, his figure moving back into the rhythm of the street. No longer the center of it, just another part of it, changed in a way that was not visible from the outside, and the small crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations picking up in low voices, some shaking their heads, others still processing, a few glancing back one last time as if trying to understand exactly what they had witnessed, because it had not been loud, it had not been dramatic, but it had shifted something real, and Marcus exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he turned fully toward his father. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, carrying the tone of a son rather than an official, and Samuel gave a faint smile, the kind that came from a place of quiet strength rather than relief. "I was all right before you got here," he said, and there was no dismissal in it, just a reminder of who he was, of the steadiness he carried, regardless of who stood beside him. And Marcus nodded, understanding immediately, a small smile touching his expression for the briefest moment before fading back into composure. "I know," he replied, and for a second, they stood there together without speaking, the connection between them not needing explanation, built over years that had shaped both of them in different ways. And then Samuel glanced down at the damp patch on the ground, the last of the water beginning to dry under the heat of the afternoon sun, and he shook his head slightly, not in frustration, but in quiet reflection. "Funny thing about water," he said, almost to himself. "It only stays where it falls for a little while." And Marcus followed his gaze, understanding the meaning beneath the words, that what had been done did not define what would remain, and he nodded once more. "But what it reveals," he added, "lasts a lot longer." And Samuel looked at him again, a deeper smile forming this time, one that carried pride without needing to say it. And he placed a hand briefly on his son's arm, a simple gesture, steady and grounding, before stepping forward, ready to continue his walk, not as someone who had been diminished, but as someone who had remained exactly who he was. And Marcus watched him take those first steps, the sunlight catching the lines of his figure as he moved with quiet dignity down the sidewalk, and after a moment, he turned back toward the street, his expression returning to its composed stillness, but his eyes carrying something more, something sharpened by what he had just witnessed, because the day had not changed the world, it had not rewritten the system, but it had revealed something undeniable, something that did not need volume or force to exist. And as the city moved on around them, the echo of that moment stayed behind, not in noise, but in understanding, in the quiet realization that respect is not given to power, it is revealed by how power chooses to act when it thinks no one is watching. The afternoon carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, yet something in the air felt permanently altered, like a quiet shift that no one could quite explain but everyone could feel, and Samuel continued down the sidewalk at his steady pace, each step measured, unhurried, his shoes brushing lightly against the concrete as the city resumed its rhythm around him. The distant hum of traffic blending with the occasional sound of a passing conversation, but now those sounds seemed softer, less intrusive, as if the world itself had taken a step back to give space to what had just unfolded, and behind him Marcus remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching his father move forward not with concern, not with urgency, but with a quiet respect, the kind that had been built over years of watching a man choose dignity even when it would have been easier not to. And after a few seconds Marcus turned, his gaze scanning the street once more, not searching, just observing, the same way he had done when he first arrived, but now with a deeper understanding of the moment he had stepped into. And near the curb the small group that had witnessed everything lingered just a little longer, their conversations low but charged, fragments of sentences floating through the air. "Did you see how calm he was?" one voice said, while another replied, "That was different. That was something else." And a young woman who had been recording lowered her phone slowly, her expression thoughtful, as if she realized she had captured more than just an incident. She had captured a lesson, something that would stay with her longer than the video itself. And across the street a man shook his head quietly, not in disbelief, but in recognition, as though he had seen something familiar in a new light. And Marcus finally began to walk, not quickly, not dramatically, just moving in the same direction as his father, his steps aligning naturally, closing the distance between them, without needing to call out. And when he reached Samuel's side again, neither of them spoke right away. The silence between them comfortable, understood, carrying more meaning than words would have added. And after a few moments Samuel glanced at a storefront window they were passing, the reflection catching both of them side by side. Two figures moving at the same pace, different in presence but connected in something deeper, and he smiled faintly. "You always did arrive at the right time," he said, his tone light but sincere. And Marcus let out a small breath that could have been a quiet laugh, though it barely made a sound. "You always made sure I knew when it mattered," he replied, and Samuel nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something he had always believed, and they continued walking, the distance behind them growing. But the moment they had left behind did not fade, not for them, not for the people who had witnessed it, and certainly not for the man who had stood at the center of it. Because a few blocks back Officer Blake had slowed his pace, his steps no longer matching the confident rhythm he had carried earlier, his mind replaying the scene in fragments, the water falling, the silence that followed, the words that had been spoken, and more than anything, the realization that it had not been about authority at all. It had been about something far simpler, something he had overlooked in the moment, and as he walked, the weight of that understanding settled in, not as guilt alone, but as something more constructive, something that demanded change rather than just regret. And he paused briefly near the edge of the sidewalk, glancing back in the direction Samuel had gone, though the older man was no longer visible from where he stood. And Blake exhaled slowly, the sound quieter than before, less guarded, as if he had stopped performing for an audience that no longer mattered. And then he straightened slightly, not in the same rigid way as earlier, but in a way that suggested awareness. And he continued walking, his pace steady but different, shaped now by something he had not carried at the start of the day. And further down the street Samuel and Marcus reached the corner, the light changing from red to green as they stepped forward together, the crosswalk line stretching out beneath them. And for a brief second, as they moved in sync across the street, the world around them felt balanced, not because it had been fixed, but because something within it had been revealed, something quiet, something powerful, something that did not need recognition to exist. And as they reached the other side, Samuel glanced ahead, his eyes calm, his posture unchanged, and Marcus followed, his presence steady beside him, and neither of them looked back, because they did not need to. What had happened behind them was already complete, already understood, and the lesson it carried did not belong to the past. It moved forward with them, carried in the way they walked, in the way they chose to respond, in the quiet certainty that real power does not announce itself. It reveals itself in the moments where it could have acted differently, but chose not to. By the time the sun began to lower just slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across the street, the moment that had unfolded earlier was no longer just an isolated incident. It had already begun to travel, carried quietly through the invisible channels of the modern world, because the phones that had been raised were not just recording, they were sharing. And within minutes clips of the scene had started appearing on screens far beyond that single block, replayed in short loops, slowed down, paused at the exact second where the water fell, where Samuel stood still, where Marcus stepped in, and people who had never set foot on that street now found themselves drawn into it, commenting, reacting, questioning. And back on the sidewalk the city moved forward, unaware of how far that moment had already reached, and Samuel and Marcus continued walking, turning onto a quieter street lined with small storefronts and shaded trees, the noise of traffic fading behind them, replaced by the softer sounds of leaves shifting in the breeze and the occasional chime of a door opening somewhere nearby. And Samuel slowed slightly, not out of fatigue, but as if giving space to something unspoken, and Marcus matched his pace without needing to ask, and after a few steps Samuel spoke again, his voice calm, reflective. "You know, when you were a boy," he said, his eyes forward, "you used to ask me why I never raised my voice when someone treated me unfairly," and Marcus glanced at him. Briefly, a faint recognition crossing his expression. "I remember," he replied, his tone quieter now, more personal, and Samuel nodded. "I told you it was because anger is loud, but dignity is lasting," he continued, and the words did not feel rehearsed. They felt lived, shaped by years of choosing restraint over reaction, and Marcus let that settle, his gaze shifting ahead as they walked. "It is harder to hold on to that in your position," he admitted, not as a complaint, but as a truth, and Samuel smiled slightly. "That is why it matters even more," he said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with understanding, and a few blocks behind them, in a different part of the city, Officer Blake had returned to his patrol car, the familiar interior now feeling different, the seat, the dashboard, the radio, all the same as before, yet none of it sat the same way in his mind, because the echo of that moment had followed him, not in noise, but in thought, replaying not just what he had done, but how easily he had done it, how quickly he had assumed. And as he sat there for a moment before starting the engine, he looked down at his hands, the same hands that had carried out countless routine actions, now holding a weight that was new, and he let out a slow breath, longer than usual, as if trying to clear something that would not simply disappear, and outside his windshield the world continued as it always did, people walking, cars passing, life moving forward without pause. But for him something had shifted, something that could not be undone by simply moving on to the next call, and he reached for the radio, hesitated for a brief second, then pulled his hand back, choosing silence instead, and back on the quieter street Samuel and Marcus reached a small park, the kind that most people passed without noticing, a few benches, a patch of grass, a single tree offering shade, and Samuel stepped toward one of the benches, not to rest from exhaustion, but as if returning to a place that felt familiar, and he sat down. Slowly, his movements steady, and Marcus remained standing for a moment before taking a seat beside him, the two of them facing forward, looking out at nothing in particular and everything at once, and Samuel leaned back slightly, his shoulders relaxing. "The world does not always change in big moments," he said softly. "Sometimes it changes in the quiet ones that people do not expect," and Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "And sometimes those are the ones people remember the most," he added, and Samuel turned his head slightly, looking at his son with a calm, knowing expression, "Not because of what was done," he said, "but because of how it was answered." And the breeze moved gently through the leaves above them, casting shifting shadows across the ground, and for a moment the world felt still again, not in tension, but in balance, and somewhere, on screens across the country, that same moment continued to play, not with shouting, not with chaos, but with something far quieter, something that made people pause, rewind, and watch again, because in a world that often mistook volume for strength, what they had witnessed was something different, something that did not demand attention, but earned it. And as Samuel sat there, calm and unshaken, and Marcus beside him, composed and steady, the story that had begun with a single act of disrespect had already become something more, something that no longer belonged to just one street, one officer, or one moment, but something that carried forward, carried quietly, in the way people would choose to act the next time they believed no one was watching. The park remained quiet as the light shifted into the softer tones of late afternoon, the kind of light that made everything feel slower, more reflective, and Samuel sat with his hands resting gently on his lap, his gaze steady ahead, not searching, not avoiding, just present, as if the weight of the day had already settled into something he understood long before it ever happened, and Marcus sat beside him, his posture composed, his eyes scanning the space not out of vigilance, but habit, a lifetime of awareness shaped by responsibility. And for a while neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty, but full of everything that did not need to be said, and somewhere in the distance a child laughed, the sound light and unburdened, cutting through the quiet like a reminder that the world still held moments untouched by tension, and Samuel let out a slow breath, almost a sigh, but not from exhaustion, more from reflection. And he leaned back slightly. Against the bench, the wood warm from the sun. "You know," he said after a moment, his voice calm and measured, "when I was your age, I thought strength meant proving something to people." And Marcus turned his head just enough to listen more closely. "What changed that?" he asked, not because he did not know, but because he wanted to hear it again, and Samuel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried memory more than amusement. "Time," he answered simply, and understanding that the people who need to see your strength are not always the ones standing in front of you. And the words settled into the space between them, quiet but lasting, and Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting again. "Today was not about him," he said, referring to the man they had left behind. "It was about what everyone else saw." And Samuel gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth in that. "And what he saw," he added, not dismissing the importance of that moment either, and Marcus considered that the idea that change did not always come from being corrected loudly, but from being shown something differently, something that stayed with you long after the moment passed. And across the city, the video continued to circulate, not with headlines of outrage or conflict, but with quiet commentary, people noticing the stillness, the restraint, the absence of reaction where one might have been expected, and it was that absence that drew attention, that held it, that made people watch again. And back in his patrol car, Officer Blake sat with the engine still off, his hands resting on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just there, as if he was grounding himself in something steady. And his mind replayed not just the action, but the aftermath, the way the moment had unfolded without resistance, without escalation, and how that had left him with something harder to ignore than any confrontation would have. And he reached for his radio again, then stopped, choosing instead to sit in the quiet a little longer, allowing the weight of understanding to settle fully, because for the first time that day, he was not thinking about control, or procedure, or authority. He was thinking about perception, about assumption, about the line between enforcing the law and forgetting its purpose, and that line no longer felt as clear as it once had. And in the park, Samuel shifted slightly, turning his head to look at Marcus, his expression calm but intent. "You did not come here to prove anything," he said. "You came here to stand for something." And Marcus met his gaze, understanding immediately. "Because you taught me that standing does not always mean stepping forward," he replied. "Sometimes it means knowing when to let truth speak for itself." And Samuel's eyes softened, pride evident not in his words, but in the quiet stillness that followed. And the breeze moved gently again, rustling the leaves above them, casting moving shadows across the ground. And as the sun dipped a little lower, the day began to close, not with noise, not with resolution shouted across the streets, but with something quieter, something deeper. And Samuel slowly pushed himself to his feet, his movements steady, deliberate, and Marcus stood with him, not out of necessity, but out of alignment, and together they began to walk. Once more, leaving the bench behind, leaving the moment behind, but carrying its meaning forward, not as a burden, but as something understood, something lived. And as they moved toward the edge of the park, the city opened up again in front of them, unchanged in appearance, yet somehow different in what it now held, because earlier that day, one man believed power came from control, from action, from being seen as the one in charge. But by the time the sun began to set, what remained was something else entirely, something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to be announced to be real. And as Samuel and Marcus stepped back onto the sidewalk, their figures moving forward with calm certainty, the truth of that moment lingered behind them like an echo that refused to fade, because he thought he was the law. But that day, the law did not raise its voice. It simply stood there, calm, unshaken, and let the truth reveal itself.